Many of you are familiar with our first presenter today, which is, of course, Matt McLachlan. Matt is the founder of Matt McLachlan Battlefield Tours, and also, of course, Living History, which presents wonderful YouTube documentaries, podcasts, the Living History podcast, Peter Hart's Military History podcast, and Treasures from the Vault. And today we're very excited to be celebrating Living History's very first book. So let me bring in Matt.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And Jess, thank you very much for the introduction. I'm really excited to be here and to be presenting this book. Living history is a passion of mine. Walking the battlefields and talking about history is something I've done for a couple of decades now, and it's just what I love doing. So there's nothing better than getting to share these wonderful stories of what went on these battlefields all around the world. So thank you, everyone, for tuning in. I hope you've all pre-ordered your copy of the book. If you haven't, there'll be a link at the end of the presentation to where you can pre-order your book. But it's been a great honour to know Peter Hart for a long time, and through visiting the battlefields together, through doing some TV series together, through doing podcasts together, I think sitting around over a beer one day, we said it would be great to do a book on some aspect of Gallipoli. And after toing and froing and a lot of discussion and probably several more beers, it led us to where we are now. And I'm just really excited that our first book is with Peter Hart, who's a dear friend of mine and a great historian. And it's just wonderful that I have the opportunity to publish this book and bring this fantastic story to life. There's no better person to tell this story than Peter Hart. And I'm just very excited by the opportunity to have the Gallipoli Evacuation. It's going to be in our hands very, very shortly. So I think it's time to bring in the man of the hour, and also, so Peter Hart, and also Gary Bain, who is Peter's partner in crime. So we'll bring both of those in. So if you haven't listened to the Peter Hart Military History podcast, you should definitely do it, and you will see Peter as he is there, and also Gary Bain, who will be joining us any second now.
Here he is.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce the John and Yoko of military history, Peter Hart and Gary Bain. Pete and Gary, thank you for being here. It's an exciting day.
It is absolute pleasure to be here. Lovely to see all of you lot as well, and thank you for everybody else who's joined us. You're all lovely.
Thank you for Jess explaining how to pronounce your name, Matt. We've got no excuse now, have we?
Everyone who, if you listen to Peter's podcast, you will hear not only a wide range. Actually, it should be called the Mispronunciation Podcast, because it's one of the most exciting aspects is hearing Peter butcher names from all over the world: French, British, Scottish, and my name especially. So, but do go and listen to Peter.
Absolute pleasure, Matt.
With, Gary, because it's a wonderful way to present military history. Are you guys enjoying doing the podcast? I'm enjoying listening to them.
I bloody hate it.
I love it. It's a chance to talk with my intellectual equals in Gary. So you know, I don't think that's a good thing now.
I've learnt an awful lot about sausages.
Well, they are an important part of anyone's diet.
So basically, the plan is this evening we are going to, in a rather relaxed attitude, as you probably you probably suspected already, is it's going to be a fairly relaxed way to just talk about the book and present the book and to launch the book. And we've got a number of special guests who are going to come in and talk about it as well. And so I think let's kick off with the first of our special guests. We did a pre-recorded interview because he couldn't join us live, unfortunately, but it's a historian I'm sure you all know. Dan Snow. And so let's hear from Dan from the interview we did a couple of days ago. Dan, thank you very much for joining us on what is a really special day, the launch of Peter's Gallipoli Evacuation book.
It's such a special day. I'm in awe of Peter. He's been a legend on the scene for years. And I guess, Peter, congratulations first of all, but secondly, how much this book is I'm fascinated to know, built from your legendary one-to-one conversations you had with so many veterans of the First World War?
There's a good chunk of it because that's veterans mean a lot to me, the interviews. It's such a great chance it was to interview these guys. But the sort of time I did it meant there weren't that many who were there at the evacuation. But the ones I did interview, I used a lot, including the legendary Joe Murray, who I think is unbelievable. A man who could tell you what he had in his pockets in 1915, I always say, which are just almost total recall. And that means a lot. I was so pleased to get him into the book, and that's what makes doing these books special. This bringing it to other people's attention, the stories that they told me, and now other people, 30 years later, they can hear it. Wow, fantastic.
Well, we're so lucky that you did those interviews, and actually, the further you get away from it, the more special they become. I mean, it's for all time. I mean, that's, the fact that my grandchildren will be able to read transcripts, maybe listen to recordings of those interviews, it just makes it. I mean, it'd be like us having access to the Battle of Waterloo or something. Like, it's just so extraordinary. Well,
it is 30 years now. Nearly 40 since I interviewed Joe Murray, and that's such a long time. And yet they will be there. They'll be there forever, hopefully. Yeah. And the War Museum are to be congratulated. I mean, I know employees aren't meant to like their old employer, but I do like the War Museum, and that they gave me the chance to do all these interviews because they paid for it. And now most of them are you can hear them on the internet. Anyone can hear them on the internet at the IWM site, and that's fantastic.
But also,
Dan, I just really wanted to ask you at this point. I mean, Pete and I are absolute Gallipoli tragics. We love everything about the story. But what does Gallipoli mean to you?
Well, I have a personal connection with Gallipoli because my great-grandfather was there. He was a medic in the Indian Army. Thomas Carey Evans, a Welsh guy, but lived and served in the Indian Army. He was actually in Mesopotamia for a while, but ended up in Gallipoli. And so I grew up with stories, oral history, testimony, much of which I'm sure isn't true, but, the hallowed stories that were passed down. And so obviously there's a personal connection, but then there is the fact that it is like you guys, you just can't not find the story unbelievably compelling. The tragedy of that first, the kind of interesting debate, the strategic debate about whether actually it was not a bad idea. Then there's the tragedy as a lover of maritime history. There's that extraordinary reverse for the Royal Navy, which we don't like talking about in British history, but a catastrophic reverse for the Royal Navy when they tried to force the Straits through naval power alone, which arguably came close to working. And then this decision to launch land operations on that peninsula to the north of the Straits. So the kind of and then the battlefield that Peter and you guys both speak so beautifully about. And then I was lucky enough to visit for the anniversary, and I saw what has to be one of the most remarkable and well-preserved battlefields that I've ever been to in the world. So I didn't even go with Peter. I didn't get shown the good stuff, but I mean, just the stuff I was able to access was kind of unmatched, really. And then there's a natural rugged beauty to it. You're having a beer above Anzac Cove, which I'm sure you guys have done many times, and you just watch that sun going down into the ocean in the west, towards the Ionians. I mean, it's just the best place to go, I think, on many levels. And so that's my connection with it. And then it's just being a fan of you, Matt, and Peter, and all your work and the extraordinary. And I think I've got a stupid question here, but this is one that I'm sure you get asked all the time. But it's obviously absurd to compare it to other battles. But we in the First World War, we're so obsessed with the mud and the blood of the Western Front. The worst place to be a human being in history. And actually, what's curious about the First World War, if you look at Mesopotamia, you look at Gallipoli, look at Salonika, I'm not sure you maybe would rather have been in northern France. I mean, it's obviously a stupid question, depends on the unit, the time of year, the place, the luck. But Peter, I mean, Gallipoli was as bad as anywhere, right?
It was. It's you've got to take away the guns because there's hardly any Turkish guns. But you're under fire for all the time you're there. There's not you don't get off. So if you land in May, say, which a lot of them did, you're there until you leave in December or January. And you're under fire. You can be killed anywhere. You can be on the beach. You can be in the front line, the support lines, the rest camps. Why do they call it rest camps? Because some of the bullets land over there. The rest come over here. And it's that was Norman Burge, Major Norman Burge, Nelson Battalion. But it's amazing, the stress levels, but then underpinning everything, I don't want to get too sordid about it, but there's dysentery and paratyphoid and jaundice and soldier's heart. And that meant that the men were reduced. I mean, we've all had a dodgy meal that's given us an upset tummy. That's not dysentery. And people don't realize how awful people felt. And you didn't get off Gallipoli because you were poorly. You had to be almost dying before you could get off.
Wow.
And that made it a hell on earth. So stress levels are unbelievable. Western Front, 3 days of front line, 3 days behind, 3 days in reserve, then a period out on reserve. You were safe, or relatively safe then. At Gallipoli, you were never safe. Stress and disease combined with brilliant Turkish sniping and, of course, the occasional shell.
And when we talk about that environment as well, I mean, when we talk about the Western Front versus Gallipoli, we're talking about the nature of the weather and the climate. And we think of Gallipoli as heat, flies, dry, which it is in the summer and soon after they arrive. But one of the things I love about your book, Pete, is the discussion of the storms, the winter storms that blew in very late in the campaign and were really the death knell for the Gallipoli campaign. That for me is something. I've written 2 books on Gallipoli before, but I'd never realised until I got into this book, how bloody awful it was during that time. It was the perfect storm, the rain and then the cold and then the freezing, and hundreds died.
And Peter, what I like about your book is when the new general arrives and just goes, we're out, it's gone, it's hopeless, it's a complete, and that moment of clarity, that moment is so powerful, because you can see if you're in the Eastern Mediterranean, you get involved in groupthink and you're sort of, and then remind me which general that was. I'm being
Monroe,
stupid.
Charles Monroe.
Yeah, so exactly. So Monroe turns up and be like, no, it's gone, out, we're leaving. And I thought that was a fascinating turning point.
I love the Churchill, because Churchill's a clever man. No one's there, but he came, he saw, he capitulated, was his take on Monroe. But to us and to people at the time, the people who knew, he came, he saw sense. And when Kitchener went out there, he too couldn't, as a competent professional soldier, he could see that you had to get off. Poor old Hamilton had been caught up. As you said rightly, groupthink, that's what it is. You're out there, that's what you're doing. And you don't think about anybody else. So Hamilton blames everybody else for what's going wrong. But in actual fact, he should have realised. And Monroe brought that clarity of vision to it. He may not have been as nice or as interesting as Hamilton. People don't write biographies of him. But I think that was a great moment. And he saved a lot of people's lives.
Well, Dan,
it was a life and death decision.
It certainly was, and it's the one thing that I'm most fascinated about with this book, Pete, is just exploring those last chapters that we don't spend enough time talking about. We talk about the landing, we talk about the August offensive, but to talk about the evacuation in this way, I think, is a real achievement. And Dan, thank you for joining us to help launch the book. We're all very excited. We're all having fun, and can't wait to get the printed copies in our hands.
Yeah, definitely. Congratulations, Peter. Thanks for having me, Matt. And it's just a great project. So good luck with it, guys.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dan.
There we have it, Dan Snow. I feel like most people would be familiar with Dan Snow's history here.
Never heard of him.
And Peter, I believe that you're going to be on Dan Snow's show soon, being interviewed about the Gallipoli evacuation. Is that interview coming up soon?
At some point, yes. I did do an interview with Dan. I covered myself with glory when he said, "What's the name of your book?" And I've already confessed to Matt, I forgot.
It's very complicated, Pete. It's very complicated. This book about the Gallipoli evacuation is called The Gallipoli Evacuation.
It could happen to anyone, couldn't it, Gary?
Oh, wonderful to have Dan join us on the show. And we have another special guest for everybody up right now. Our next special guest served in the Royal Navy, initially as a submariner before becoming a specialist in amphibious warfare. He obtained the rank of Rear Admiral and was captain of the HMS Fearless. the headquarters ship for the 1982 landings to repossess the Falkland Islands, the largest amphibious operation since World War II, and the farthest ever from base. We're thrilled to welcome Admiral Jeremy Larken.
Hey! Hello, Jeremy.
Hey!
Well, just thank you, everybody. Thank you very much for having me. First, and off we go, it gives me now very great pleasure formally to launch Peter Hart's new book, The Gallipoli Evacuation, launched. So, you've asked me to perhaps fill in a bit of background. For those many who are familiar with Peter, this is, and indeed you, his great colleagues, this is revision. But for those who aren't so familiar with Peter as many, he is a very well-known eminent historian specializing in the First World War. And amongst, by my count, some 15, is it, Peter, of your World War I books are The Somme, Jutland, 1916, a particular interest of my own, Bloody April, The Air War, 1917, Passchendaele, Aces Falling, that's the Air War, 1918, 1918, A Very British Victory, and his previous book, Gallipoli, touching on the same subject that we're talking about today. And Peter has, of course, this deep interest in Gallipoli, and I would rate him a foremost author of that disastrous Anglo-French Dardanelles campaign. And I thought I'd talk a little bit of background about it and the strategic situation to which it gave rise and where we've been since, because actually amphibious warfare is, or was, my business. First of all, we have here a fine and very thorough examination of the evacuation from Gallipoli. And I would predict it'll become a definitive history of that particular bit of the campaign. It's immaculately structured, rich in quotations by participants, stage by stage, and exhaustively researched. I'd just like to stand back a moment because in case people are unfamiliar with the big background, it's been mentioned by Dan and indeed you all, but the strategic aim was to force and keep open a passage through the Dardanelles Narrows, then into the Sea of Marmara, which is the bit to the north, before you get to Constantinople, as Istanbul was then known, with the aim of getting Turkey out of the war on the German side and to create a logistic route to Russia. Now, strategies must be based on assumptions, and amongst multiple wrong assumptions here was the Turkish army was ineffective. Well, revisited today are all, of course, the what-if possibilities. What if it had been successful? Well, there is a school of thought that Russia would then have been given sufficient support to have prevented the collapse that led to the Russian Revolution. I know it's Peter's view, and I think I agree with him, the competence of the Turkish army with the German support which it possessed does actually make this moonshine, but nevertheless, that is the background that was Churchill's, I think, quite proper vision. Well, it was, of course, a massive amphibious operation. And a bit about amphibious warfare. Amphibious warfare, for those who aren't familiar with the expression, it's opposed invasion from the sea, often small or medium scale, or occasionally massive, like Gallipoli, and the greatest of all, of course, the 1944 D-Day landings in Normandy. It's immensely complex, and it demands the closest inter-service cooperation and mutual support. And these, of course, are qualities essentially lacking in the tragically ill-planned and badly executed Gallipoli campaign, as many of you know very well. Just two elements stand out from this mess as carrying a measure of success. The first was the submarine campaign. Some submarines, after some experiments, managed to get through against the current that comes outwards from through the straits, got into the Sea of Marmara, which is the open space before you get to Istanbul, which gives me as a Cold War submariner happiness. The submarine campaign went quite well, was very effective, did a lot to tie down the Turkish supply lines and could have been to an extent critical to the Turkish side. The second is, of course, the evacuation, which Peter here presents. And a military correspondent is reputed to have written, as long as wars last, the evacuation of Suvla and Anzac will stand before the eyes of all strategists as hitherto unattained masterpieces. Okay, but as Churchill, one of the chief architects, of course, and during political casualties of the campaign, one remarked after the Dunkirk evacuation in 1940, wars are not won by evacuation. So, Peter treats the whole evacuation battle, and it was a battle, it was a successful battle since hardly anyone got killed. Admiral dispassionate from start to finish. Superb. From failure, of course, in resilient organizations, there does come learning. And the Gallipoli campaign did become a foundation source of study and development, enabling many and various amphibious operations, prominent in the Second World War, to defeat both Germany and Japan. And it remains so, although there have been some wobbles, which I'll mention briefly. But of course, many are familiar with the early efforts, Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa, the first big Anglo-American amphibious operation, then several more in Europe, and of course the great amphibious rolling across the Pacific under the direction of General Douglas MacArthur. We generally recognize that in 1914, the Royal Navy entered the First World War at the end of what is referred to as the long lee of Trafalgar, lee being on the leeward side, you know, the downwind side of something in sailing terms, near a century long, and it permitted huge technical developments from the wooden walls of Trafalgar, the Victory, which many of you I'm sure have walked around, to obscure some key principles of effective warfighting at sea, which Admiral Nelson and colleagues perfected during the wars leading up to the defeat of Napoleon, which of course went on for many years. Moreover, in 1914, the art of truly joint operations, which is so central to modern warfare, was in a state of what we might call unconscious incompetence. I'm sure you're familiar with the unconscious incompetence, conscious incompetence, conscious competence, and unconscious competence bit, where we write down at the bottom unconscious incompetence. And this, Gallipoli, together with the Doggerbank and Jutland, constituted a traumatic wake-up call for the British Navy. But it did enable a hugely better performance in the Second World War, albeit with less overwhelming assets. And the Navy is the one service of the three deeply engaged for all the 6 years of World War II. And most historians would recognize that actually it was absolutely crucial to the success of operations. We are, of course, enthralled by the Battle of Britain, but the Battle of Britain was really fought to ensure the Navy excluded any possibility of invasion in what the Germans called Operation Sea Lion, which would have been a very badly equipped amphibious operation, by the way, had it happened. And of course, the Battle of the Atlantic, which was a ferocious affair going on for the 4 central years of the war. Great heroism by lots of very ordinary people manning merchant ships with no ability whatsoever to do anything but steam along and hope that nothing frightful went wrong. Now, I'll conclude very quickly with a couple of personal notes. I ought to mention quickly, actually, the Falklands campaign, for which I was quite a prominent operator as captain of HMS Fearless, as Jess has mentioned. It was quite a performance. It was a formidable affair, but it came out of nowhere. And I am very proud of the fact that actually, despite it was a form of warfare, since we were all trained now for the Battle of the Atlantic and anti-submarine warfare there in support of the US striking fleet, the NATO striking fleets, we did adapt ourselves to the totally unfamiliar and surprising, unexpected situation of the Falklands with great success. And none of the commanding officers needed to be sacked for incompetence. It really went remarkably well. I've just 2 personal notes on which to end. First, immediately following the Falklands campaign, I deployed Fearless to the Mediterranean to pay a formal visit to Istanbul, would you believe, the Turkish Navy and Army. And I steamed the ship in escort through the Dardanelles and northeast across the Sea of Marmara. But secondly, I'm privileged today to have a second office for floating home in the Aegean Sea, which I occupy for some 6 weeks during the summer. Would you believe it, I'm off there next Wednesday. Now the Greek government kindly makes us welcome following a bit of abatement of COVID-19. Last year we sailed to Lemnos, which is one of the 2 islands from which all the basing for the Gallipoli Dardanelles operation took place. And Mudros Harbour is a large harbour, so peaceful that it's hard, just as in San Carlos in the Falklands, to imagine it was once the centre of a huge naval and military operation. Around Mudros are 2 war cemeteries from the Gallipoli campaign, mainly for for people who were evacuated to Lemnos, to the hospitals there, and those that died, many hundreds. A fraction, of course, of the huge number, many unidentified, who died on the peninsula itself and were buried some years afterwards, often unidentified. I find this immensely moving. Many of you are used to going around war cemeteries. I do it whenever I can. But we turned up at these two cemeteries, emblazoned across the gates, of course, their name liveth forevermore. Now, my 22-year-old son, who plans to join the Royal Marines, said we must therefore say hello to each of them, which over 2 or 3 very hot hours we were privileged to do. So, I do hope this fine study of the evacuation of Gallipoli will take its place as a definitive history and reference. And please, Peter, I hope it sells very well. And thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. I know, and I'd like to say thank you to the War Museum, because it was the War Museum sending me down to interview you. That was how I come to know you. And the great thing is that in future years, not now, hello, people, I'm easily distracted. People will be able to listen to your interview. I mean, obviously it's embargoed now, but I love this idea that, just like I was talking to Dan about people being, interviews I did 30 years ago, will be able, you can hear it in the future. So it is that you'll be able to, in the future, hear myself and Jeremy talking through his career, all the submarines he was on, and in great detail. I can't remember how long it was, but it was about 20 hours. And this is the future. You've got to do these recordings. And I hope the War Museum is going to carry this on in the future. But thank you very much, Jeremy, for your kind words. You really are a star. Thank you very much.
A great pleasure, and I hope it goes well. And you're working together, all of you, and Matt, tremendous. So many thanks.
Cheers.
It's been a real pleasure to have you, Admiral Larken. And I just, the thing that struck me when you were speaking is, well, firstly, I could have listened to you for many more hours, so we'll have to, I'm looking forward to hearing those recordings one day that you did with Peter. But I think one of the things that I'm always very big on pressing with people is that history doesn't belong on dusty old shelves. That history is a living creature. It's evolving as we go on. And you, sir, are a direct link with what we're talking about here, the Gallipoli evacuation. Through your service in the Navy, through your experiences in wartime, you're the inheritor of that legacy of the Gallipoli landings and the Gallipoli evacuation. And it's just wonderful to have you here talking about your experiences, because we can see that direct link to the subject that we're all discussing today, the Gallipoli evacuation. So thank you so much for taking the time. It's been a real privilege to have you here.
It's a pleasure. It remains a textbook. And I just add that it is even so a tender plant, because there's huge pressures on defence spending. It's always one of the things that comes under the spotlight as, shall we just ease back on that? And we were almost in danger of doing that. The Secretary for Defence, John Knott, just before the Falklands, was busy trying to say the 2 amphibious ships, Fearless and Intrepid, should be short-lived. And I'm happy to say he came on board Fearless for a day, couldn't believe what he was seeing, and said, crikey, we must keep on with these ships. That was just 4 months before the Falklands operation started. We have 2 successor ships, Albion and Bulwark, which are now halfway through their lives, and I just hope that we're going to be able to move forward, continuing that enormously important capability. Thank you again.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. And we hope that you can stick around for the rest of the event, but for now we will say farewell. It was wonderful, wonderful to have you, Admiral Larken. You truly, it's incredible just what, you know, everybody that serves our countries are capable of across all the allied forces, and we thank everybody for their service. It's wonderful. With that in mind, we actually have put together a special video that we wanted to share with everybody that pays honour to the veterans from Gallipoli.
One of these egg bombs landed on my cover that I enlisted with. I'd been living with all my life. Landed on his head and completely blew his head off. I was standing alongside of him. That was a shock.
we fired up parting shots, and I thought to myself, well, you know, I don't like sticking away like this. You know, after all this bloody trouble, I thought to myself, I'd walk head high, you know, we'd done something, we captured something, we'd captured that Chihuahua. And I was very distressed in my own mind. I was very sad. And then, of course, I thought to myself, well, we're stealing away.
Suddenly I found a fucker behind me. I only had a Lewis gun which I observed could fire forwards and downwards. Tried to get it to bear but couldn't, and he had several bursts at me from behind and then made off.
It was in quite big letters, the front of the paper, Churchill's tragic blunder, and that gave us a bit of hope. Everybody smiled about that on Gallipoli, because if there was a blunder, Gallipoli was.
Every time I see that video, or every time I've listened to the special audio interview that you did, Pete, that we put together for all of those people that have already pre-purchased the Gallipoli evacuation, with all the recordings of the Gallipoli veterans, it's so powerful. It's such a special, incredible thing to actually hear the veterans themselves speaking about their experiences.
Well, it was great to interview them, I can assure you. It seems so long ago now. Well, it was, but Matt wasn't even born when I was doing those interviews.
Wow.
I don't think that's quite true, but I'll take the compliment.
And actually, our next special guest, who will be joining us this evening,
Gary's favourite,
is somebody who has also interviewed many World War I veterans. And so now I'm thrilled to welcome historian and author Richard Van Emden.
Oh, I thought it was Nigel Steele.
Hello. Oh, Gary, I can't believe you said that.
Hello, Richard.
Hi, Gary.
you can never...
How are you?
Very well.
Good to see you. Thank you for coming. I believe you just landed this morning in Jersey or somewhere.
Yes. We weren't even coming here until 3 days ago, and my wife just said, we've got to get away. And when I said what day, she said Sunday. I went, we better get there early then, because I'm here to congratulate you, Peter, on what I know will be a fantastic book.
Thank you very much, Richard. It's great to see you, and thank you for making the effort. And it sounds like you have the same sort of relationship as with your wife that I have with my own dear Polly, and indeed Janet. Matt,
I couldn't possibly say.
Best not.
Richard, thank you so much for joining us. This is actually the first time we've been speaking to each other face to face.
We have, yes, it is.
I know.
Indeed.
So it's a rare privilege for me. So if everyone, we should just have a chat, and everyone else could just tune out if they want to. But thank you for taking the time. That video that Jess just showed that we put together, and we could hear those haunting voices of the Gallipoli veterans. It's something that I know that you, as an author of books about Gallipoli, I know you have spoken to veterans as well. And as someone who didn't really have that opportunity, I felt I was born 10 or 20 years too late to really have that opportunity to speak to World War I veterans. I'm really interested just to hear, now that we've got two historians here who have done a lot of work with speaking to veterans, how, Peter and Richard, how important is that, as not just the work that you've done, Peter, on this book, on the Gallipoli evacuation, but in all your books? How important is this idea of oral history, hearing from the veterans in their own voices?
Well, oral history is part of your armory as a historian. What you do with oral history is find out what people thought happened and what they thought about some of the things that are not reflected in personal correspondence. You do not write about going to the latrines 14 times in a night to your mum or your girlfriend. So oral history, when you record interviews about Gallipoli, they talk about the latrines a lot, an awful lot. They talk about dysentery, they talk about all sorts of unpleasant things. And that it can be airbrushed out of history. Also, I'm sure you found this, Richard. You often get official regimental history saying the boys were dying to get into action, or the boys were very disappointed that they couldn't go over the top. And yet, when you talk to the boys say, "Jesus, what are you joking?" And if you talk to any veteran like Gary, who played an important part in the Cold War, I think he was actually a Russian spy, you'll find that that's not what people are like. I don't want to rabbit on.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you entirely, Peter. I mean, I always remember one veteran saying to me that the first time he went over the top and he survived, and he was one of very few to answer the first roll call. And he said what really shocked him, what really took his breath away, was the idea that this wasn't an end. He hadn't just done it and succeeded and survived. He was going to do it again, and he would do it again, and he would do it again until he was wounded or killed. And that was the real shock, was the fact that he managed to get through 10 hours of combat, and with the full knowledge that this would now continue. But as that generation that we spoke to, and you spoke to lots of Gallipoli veterans, I didn't speak to that many. I probably spoke to about a dozen or so, something like that. But it was the little tiny vignettes that you got from that I found so fascinating. And I was looking back at one particular story that I came across. I spoke to a man called Arthur Price, who was with the Hampshires, the 8th Battalion. And one lovely little anecdote. It was so sad. He said there was a lad called Dotty Fred, and he was called Dotty because he was a bit simple. He never held a job in civilian life. So how he got into the army, he was not too sure. And he said he saw him. He was walking down from a field, a field ambulance, and he saw Dotty Fred lying there on his back, sort of legs and arms spread, apparently dead, with flies crawling out of his mouth. And he thought, poor Dotty Fred, what an end. And he said, and about 4 years later, he was walking around Shanklin on the Isle of Wight. And who should he see but Dotty Fred? And Dotty Fred said, he had a real touch of dysentery that day. And he'd been absolutely poleaxed to the point that these flies were crawling out of his mouth. Everyone assumed he was dead, but no, Dotty Fred lived to survive another day. And it's those sort of stories that I say could be so easily airbrushed from history. And I love them. And I know that what I've always liked about your books, Peter, is that I can read quotes that I won't read elsewhere. I'm a little bit tired of reading about battle after battle after battle, but you don't do that. You pull out little stories, little just moments in history that actually live with you more than thrusting yet another bayonet into a Turk, and that's what I love about your work. And this is why, I have to admit something. The Evacuation was on my list of books to do. That is the first one I've ever come across where I've gone, oh, bugger. Whoops. But it's, it's such a great story. It's such an incredible story. And you've done it right from the Great Storm, which is when you would take that story from. It will be a terrific read.
A question I have for both of you, Richard and Peter, is we have a perception of what we think. Those of us who didn't get to speak to dozens of veterans, we have a perception of what these men were like and what they went through. You must have had the same thing before you spoke to these veterans. How much did your perception of what war was like, how much did that change when you actually got to speak to the men who lived through it? You
go first, Richard.
we can't have any idea what it's like to go that sort of moment of going over the top, where Ben talked about it sort of being like jumping into ice cold water, and then that actually, once you got over the top, then you settled down. But the perception, my God, I had no perception of what it was like to go into action. And in a sense, I can't really get to grips with it now. I've read things that have horrified me to the core, and I can't believe that men do these things to one another. I mean, one of the most poignant anecdotes I ever heard from one veteran was when he saw a sergeant of, I can't remember, the Queen's, I think, bayoneting a German, and the German managed to get his bayonet in first, and they bayoneted each other. And then he watched his sergeant put his rifle down and said, "Come on, Fritz, you know, our war's over now." And they both carried each other out of the trench, held each other out of the trench, having just simultaneously bayoneted each other. And I just find those sort of stories absolutely heartrending. But I even now, after whatever 40 years of studying this, I can't even begin to say what it's really like to go into action. But I get a soupçon from all these veterans, and it just gives me that little window into something which I will never understand. That is why I'm fascinated, because I'm absolutely damn sure I'd run the other way. I would be the most shot for cowardice, because I admire the fact that they were able to hold it together and go forward.
That's very true for me as well. I think the main thing from my meeting veterans that I learned, and I don't want to repeat that because I think much of what you do there, is that all of life is there. There is no one size fits all veteran. There are quiet types who don't drink. There are drunken bums. There are no, I won't point at Gary. there are all sorts. There are funny people. The service personnel are often funny, and they hide things, horrible things, behind a laugh and a joke. Sometimes they hide things that you almost think they shouldn't be hiding behind a laugh and a joke. There's religious types, there's atheists, there's loud, obnoxious people. They're not all nice. There's no plaster saints. It's not that kind of thing. That's what I took away from meeting the veterans, which is what you'd expect. They are, because of the armies were a cross section of British society. You get a cross section of British society, so you get all sorts in the army, from whatever his name, Dotty to
Dotty Fred, yeah,
to Dotty Gary.
Did you ever, I don't know if this ever happened to you, Peter, but did you ever have a veteran, while he was talking about his experiences, actually start to relive them? Did that ever happen? In the sense
Murray.
that, he actually began to sort of almost fantasize that he was there, but he was back there at that moment.
Joe Murray, who features a lot in all of my things, would start to do the gestures he was doing. So if he was in a fight, he'd start playing it. He didn't think he was there, but he was blind or nearly blind, and so that meant it was his way of muscle memory and things sort of took over. And when I interviewed Gary, he kept raising his right hand in a repetitive manner.
Were you at the pub?
I'm hoping that's what it was, and nothing too untoward. But so that but not many of them. Some of them broke down, absolutely broke down, and because we weren't the BBC or a commercial media organisation, I always switched the tape recorder off the moment they started to cry, got them a drink of water, the usual things you do, and then tried to start again, because it's not our job to upset 89, well, they were 88 to 95 when I was doing most of mine. It's not your job to upset people that much. It's always quite heartrending when they cry. It just is.
Yes. I had one incident which I thought was the only one I ever had in the 270 veterans that I interviewed, where he started screaming and shouting like he was there. And that was very, very predictable. He completely lost it, and he was over to you, over, behind you, just get that. And he started. He was back there at that moment, and that was probably the closest that I've ever felt I could be to being in action, in a sense, because I was irrelevant. I wasn't in the room anymore. he was back there in this German trench, screaming and shouting, and it was just it was the amount of conversation, the amount of telling other people what was going on. Get down, he's behind, he's there. And that, I thought, was very, I've got that on a tape somewhere, on a cassette tape somewhere. But that was the only time I've ever been really perturbed. But it was also probably the only time that I got the most incredible window on that kind of frenetic, kill or be killed, world of trench fighting.
That is a really strange window into it. One thing I would mention is the reason I think I first met Richard was Richard donated all his interviews to the Imperial War Museum, and that is vitally important. It's not just about doing interviews, because that's great, but you will die, especially you, Gary. We've got a bit of a side bet on £50 who dies first. I've given him a 10-year start. I'm reasonably optimistic there. But you have to arrange for archival preservation. So if you do an interview and you've got important historical material on that, then like you did, Richard, and like Lynn MacDonald and others have done, you make sure you deposit it so that in the future people can hear what you're talking about. That is crucial.
The only downside to that, Peter, was you were taping these guys and the knowledge of what you were doing. I was doing it for a hobby as a 20-year-old, complete ignoramus. I had no idea what I was talking about, and half of my tapes have got me asking if I could go to the toilet. So I really do need a bit of editing.
No, you can't. No, sit there and listen. They call them the cross-legged tapes.
Gary, I wanted to ask you a question here. As I've never had the privilege of serving in the military, and I would never pretend to understand what it's like. As someone who has served in the military, and you've obviously now spent a lot of time around Pete and reading the books and hearing these stories, do you feel that connection with these people? Is there a thread that links people through the generations that have put on the uniform and served?
Yeah, I mean, I think I like the experiences. So I think of oral history, they're not testimonies, and you shouldn't treat them as testimonies, because if people relaying their experience, and that's the bit that I think flows right the way through. I've known Peter for some time now. I have no idea what he's doing. You're trying to kill a fly or something?
I'm trying to stop my wife from playing loud instructions on how to make clothes.
Oh, okay. And I've visited a number of battlefields with him. And for me, it's all about the personal experience, because, Joe Murray talked about what Joe Murray saw. And one of his quotes, he leaps over a Turkish trench and he talks about getting caught right in the nick, as somebody bayonets him, basically, as he jumps over the trench. That's fascinating. That's his experience at that moment, at that time. Nobody else had that. Nobody else could talk about it. And that, I think, is the common theme throughout. Richard's books, all joking aside, I think are written in a very similar way, and it's all from the perspective of the experience of the veterans. And I think that's common throughout.
Well, I think having the privilege of being part of this wonderful book project and just seeing the significance of hearing from those veterans, not just in this book, but all your books, Pete, it's such a vital part of what you do, and Richard, of what you have done as well. Thank you so much for joining us. It's wonderful to have you here and to just be celebrating what is a wonderful achievement from Peter Hart. So thank you so much for taking the time on your holiday to join us.
Thank you very much. Well, if I had the book with me, I'd be sat on the beach reading it straight away. But I'm really looking forward to reading it. It will be a fantastic book, Peter. I have every single one of your other books. And I know it will be as good as those, and I'm very jealous that you got in ahead of me. It's a great story.
Thank you, Richard.
I do have to say, Richard, there's so much. What Peter's book has demonstrated to me is there's so much to explore on this topic that I'm sure there's room for more than one book on the subject of the evacuation, because it's just such a compelling story. So I'd be very interested to hear what you've got to say on the matter as well.
Well, thank you very much. I think Peter's will be definitive. I suspect it will be the absolute one, the go-to book. So now I'm gonna look and do something else. But I very much look forward to reading it.
What's that book on your stand behind you, Gary?
Oh, you mean the Richard Van Enden Plinth?
I had noticed
1918 by Richard Van Enden.
Oh, very good, that. Very good. Have you read it yet?
No.
Don't worry.
You're supposed to say yes. It's very good. We rehearsed that.
Well, Richard, thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Pleasure, Matt.
Pleasure.
Lovely to join you all.
Get down to that beach.
Enjoy your holiday.
I'm off there now.
Enjoy the beach, Richard.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Oh, I like him.
I know. And I'm sure everybody's looking forward to reading the book. I think in about a month, anybody who has pre-ordered will be receiving it, and then you can all settle down and start reading it. And it certainly does include many, many quotes from many, many veterans. And when I read it, Peter, I just was like, wow, the stories from the men themselves are incredible.
Thank
you. I hope everyone's enjoying what we're doing here. We appreciate you tuning in. Obviously, in the COVID environment, we would much prefer to be doing this in London over a beer, but this is the way we have to do things these days. So I hope everyone's enjoying just everything that we're presenting here. But now it's time for the interactive part of the presentation, because we've had a lot of people sending questions for Peter in particular, for Gary as well, even some for me, which is fantastic. Also, what I wanted to say is, Jess, I think the message system is available that people can click on there, the chat button. And if you're watching now and haven't sent in a question, if you've had a question that you've thought of during this discussion, please feel free to type it into the chat box and we will get to as many as we possibly can. So feel free to send in questions now while we're talking, but I've got a list here in front of me of questions. So we're going to dive right in. I hope you're ready, Peter and Gary.
Well, I was just looking at the rude personal message that bastard Rob Thompson sent me. He can... FRO.
So I'm going to start with, so we've had quite a few questions, so we'll go through as many as we possibly can. We've got one here from Anthony Nestor. So a lot of these are specifically about the elements of the evacuation, and people will find out in the book the expanded version of the story, but it's a good opportunity to touch on some of these points. So Anthony Nestor writes, Peter, were the Turkish forces on the peninsula in any position to, or were they preparing offensive action against Anzac British and Indian troops around the dates of the evacuation?
A simple answer is not really, particularly at Anzac and Suvla, where in fact the Turkish commanders, and you can see this in the various accounts, such as Kanengeiser and the material discovered by Harvey Broadbent for his book on the Turkish from researching the Turkish archives, is that fundamentally the deception plans were so good that the Turks thought we were about to attack. The British were about to attack the Turks. Now this is that would have failed, and also the Australians and New Zealanders and the British at Suvla had prepared such effective defence works that any Turkish attack would have failed as well. These places were just fortified to the nth degree, and indeed when Kanengeiser saw the British defences, he had at Suvla, he admired them, and at Anzac. At Helles it's slightly different, and the Turks did launch a test attack on the day before the evacuation. But even then, with only about 20,000 left, less than that even. Statistics is just not my thing. There were 20,000, 19,063 guns. They launched an attack on the right-hand side, but that was held mainly thanks to the Royal Navy. And time again, you have to pay tribute to the work of the Royal Navy. That's not just because Jeremy may still be here. The Royal Navy is the backdrop behind which everything else happens. So the answer is no. The Turks were not in a fit position to launch an offensive, but they would have been. Gary, sorry.
Well, I was going to say that's true in Anzac and Suvla, but there was the attack on the 7th of January in the Helles sector during the evacuation. Yeah. And I think General Lyman von Sonders was tempted, I think, around that stage to launch an attack to kick the Brits into the sea, as he described it. So I think longer term, they would have had a plan.
They did have a long-term plan, and they would eventually have but they didn't need to attack. They could have just battered us off with guns, as they brought in all the guns that were coming through from Austria-Hungary, through Bulgaria after Bulgaria joined the war. Is that okay, Matt?
That's great. Thank you. Very well said. I should add as well that we had quite a few questions from people that related quite specifically to family service, which I know is a really important part of the story to so many people. It's probably a little bit out of the scope of what we're able to do, is that sort of family research, but there are some very good resources on the web where you can find out about your own family. And feel free to contact me through Facebook or Twitter, and I'm certainly happy to point you in the right direction for where you can find out more about your family history if you've got questions about specific people that served at Gallipoli. But a follow-up here, Pete and Gary, from again from Anthony Nestor. He asked the question which relates to what we were talking about with Richard about the importance of oral history. Do we think that organisations like the Australian War Memorial, the Imperial War Museum, are they investing enough time, effort and money in the collection of oral history?
In my view, the War Museum was excellent. It's started slightly to fall off its perch now because of cutbacks. But I owe my whole career was working on oral history for the War Museum, and I'm indebted to them. And they're far-sighted because they started in the 70s. I joined them in 81. But they were far-sighted, which got a good basic... So they've done thousands of interviews. I think the AWM is not quite as well placed, but they have been doing work, and of course, various authors have supplied their recordings. It is something that has been interfered with. I'm now a freelancer for the War Museum, mainly because I just enjoy meeting people like Jeremy and Gary, although they are very, very different people. The thing is, at the moment, it's very difficult to do oral history because of COVID. You can't be in the same room and travel about and be with elderly veterans. And I'm elderly as well, where I'm over the age at which you're supposed to be careful. So this is interfering with the process of oral history. It doesn't matter for a year or so, but over a period of time, this is going to become a serious concern, because as we've found today, the occasional glitch, you can't interview people on Zoom and get the right sound quality. For instance, when we do podcasts, myself and Gary, we record the tracks not on Zoom. We record them on our own machines, and then a very, very highly paid editor knits them together. That's often you, Nat, but Matt. Nat, who's Nat?
Nat. we got the surname right now. We're going to get the first name wrong.
Yeah, well, it's very similar, and so there is a problem if this goes on for too long. I feel for my colleagues, my oral history colleagues, and the freelancers at the War Museum who are not able to work at the moment.
Well, it's a narrow window, isn't it? Obviously, if we don't capture these memories before these people are gone, obviously there's no second chances.
Well, even Falkland veterans are now pushing 80.
I think that's a good point. I think that may well be why the Imperial War Museum was quite so forward-looking in the 70s, because they realised that the Great War veterans at that time were diminishing, and they had a smaller pool, if you'll pardon the expression, in which to interview. So, from my own experience, Peter described me as a Cold War warrior, which is true. That's arguably how you would describe me. I was based in Germany. So interviewing me, I don't have a lot to contribute in terms of experience, other than the fact that was a significant part of the British Army experience. And I think I'm unaware what the Australian War Museum is doing, but funding must be an issue. These things have to be funded properly. And yeah, exactly. People have got to travel. As veterans get older, they're not likely to be able to travel to be interviewed. So people have got to get about, and that all requires funding.
No offence to any of our historian colleagues that are listening in as well, but there's also an argument about the value of oral history. There are people in the history profession who don't think it's that important to get every soldier's account of what went on at the time. So it's. I mean, we love hearing it. I mean, in many ways we're preaching to the choir. We love hearing these men tell their stories in their own words. But that's not a universal opinion. Some people feel that if you've had a few people explain what it's like, you don't need to capture everyone's opinion. So it's not a given that we'll continue to do this. I hope we will. And Peter, your work, the work that Richard's done, is a great example of why it's important. But it's not a given that it will continue. So let's hope that it does in the future. Adam Bloom, a dear friend of everything we do, the podcasts and the tours and everything, he writes, Peter, what was your main purpose for writing the book? Why did you choose to write about the evacuation? Was it a story that hasn't been told enough, or was it something else that motivated you to write the book?
Story not told enough. I've done 2 books on Gallipoli, both of which had detailed chapters on there's one of them, that was with Nigel Steele, Defeated Gallipoli, and then my book Gallipoli, which was on my own. There's a lot about the evacuation in there, but the details of the story were not there. And also it's the sheer drama of it just excited me. And will they get away with it or not? Yeah, we know they get away with it, but it seems impossible they'll get away from Anzac in particular. But the problems at Suvla is 3 or 4 miles back from the front line. Anzac, they're right next to each other. And then poor old Helles, they're not only are they right next to each other, just feet between the trenches, but they've got to go back 3 miles. And this builds up. It's just a horrendous problem. And then it's an Australian hero, Cyril Brudenell-White, I forgot his name. Unforgettable, and his contribution with the silent periods. And it's such a modern idea, conditioning. You condition the Turks, and and I loved it all. And then I wasn't meant to deliver it until, I can't remember the schedule, and of course, Matt, I would have ignored it. But I think I was meant to deliver in sometime around August, September. But because of COVID, we're all locked in. So I just got on with it because I couldn't go to the pub in the evening. So that and the podcasts have kept me very busy. I'm as busy, I'm far busier. Ask Bryn Hammond, who won't be listening, but ask Bryn Hammond how busy I used to be when I worked for the War Museum. He'll tell you, not very, bastard.
I think something you touched on there, Peter, I think is important with the evacuation is there's a huge amount of hindsight we apply to it. We know that it worked. But that doesn't mean at the time when you first say, okay, boys, let's go, let's sneak off. I mean, it was every step of the way, it was courting disaster. So to tell that story, to reveal how many times it could have been an absolute disaster, it's just a captivating tale.
It is, and I've enjoyed writing the book, and it is the future of Gallipoli studies. I, as a historian, want no more single-volume histories. You might say that's because myself and Richard Van Emden and Stephen James have done ours, along with Robin Pryor and all the others. But there is nothing to say in a single-volume history. Their histories are becoming very samey, and what we need is books on just episodes. Second Krithia, the third Krithia, the Battle of the 28th of June. What about things like The Boot, which I know you haven't been to, Matt, for some reason. I mean, Gary's been to them. I mean, all experienced Gallipoli people have been there, but I understand you haven't been to The Boot. Yeah, I'm very surprised to hear that.
No, I haven't. I'm sensible. I don't have a death wish when I'm at Gallipoli, but it's for those who don't know, it's a rather treacherous journey in Suvla to one of the most far-flung outposts on the entire Gallipoli line. And we'll get there, Pete. We'll get there hopefully next year when we get back to Gallipoli.
Well, we were going to go this year, but obviously not. So.
Next year. And if you want to come, anyone's listening, want to come, we are organising a tour for September next year. Pete and I traipsing the battlefields once again. Ian McMillan, another technical question about putting the book together. Which one I like. How long did it take you, Peter, to firstly research the book and then to write it? And then he puts in brackets, is Matt a good boss? And I should point out, I'm in no way would you think I'm your boss, but I certainly appreciate the compliment, Ian. But yeah, so tell us about the process of putting the book together. What's that, Gazza?
About 5 minutes and no.
It didn't take us, because of COVID and being trapped in the house, it did not take more than about 3 months to write up. The research took a lot longer, but I was spending, in February, and January and February, I spent a lot of time at the War Museum in their library. And of course, I've got my own library. This is 1/5 of my book collection. Well, you can't see it. It's about 1/10 of it. And so I went through every book there. when I couldn't go to the War Museum anymore. I'd done most of the Gallipoli collection there. What you very quickly find when writing a book is you haven't got space for everything, and as an author, you're cutting down rather than adding. So once you've got a narrative that tells the story with sufficient quotes that you haven't used before, then you can get on with it. I have reused some quotes, but it would be madness not to use the very best quotes again. But I've tried to make that as little as possible. But some people like Murray, you just can't do without. There's nobody going to be as good as that. Some of the key participants, you see the quotes again. But it was great fun. And is Matt a good boss? Well, I really do think that we're chums. With one exception, when we were I was working for him on the 2015 and Matt, who had about 40,000 million people on that tour and about 3 million guides. And there was one guide who persistently misbehaved, back-chatted him, got in the way, insisted on making what he considered, as Polly often says, you're not as funny as you think you are. And someone described it as 1 minute I was up with Matt, and then the next minute I was down.
Well, every relationship has its ebbs and flows, Pete. So mostly.
Well, yours seems to be compressed very closely in time. I've noticed. You up and then very swiftly down. Yeah, never mind. Well, there's that look, Gary. You missed it. That look that I used to see in 2015. That's it.
Well, it's actually Simon Massey asks. Well, he actually says he really enjoys the podcasts, the fascinating information you share. I assume he's talking about you two, and especially the entertaining banter. So his question is, how did you two meet and become such good friends?
Well, honestly, we were down at Tidworth Barracks, and Pete was doing a presentation. I think Richard Van Emden was there as well that day.
He was.
And
you only had eyes for him, as I remember.
I did. Peter was on last, I think, because you can't put him on first because everybody will leave. And so I was asked by a mutual friend, Major Chris Carney, to go over a pub with Peter for lunch and just make sure he behaved himself. So we went over this pub. I seem to remember it was quite lovely with sticky carpets and all that sort of thing. And throughout the day, Pete kept forgetting my name. So I said to him, I think I met him at a WFA event or something, or Great War Forum a couple of months later. And I said to him, well, you know, we met there, Pete, but you couldn't remember my name. And he said, well, you were so fat, I didn't think I'd bother learning it because you wouldn't live with me. And I just thought, right, I'm going to stick around long enough till you remember it. And we've been great friends ever since.
We have. So you're not telling him the Turkish brothel story?
We're not telling him the Turkish brothel, no, because that's just made up. That's just wishful thinking in your head.
From the battlefields comes this great romance, and you two have been life partners ever since. And I actually love your affectionate little nicknames for each other. That Pete, sometimes you refer to Gary as Polly, and Gary, sometimes you refer to Pete as Janet. It's strange. It's strangely, appealing. But
he was dressed as Janet before we started this podcast, with nice long black hair.
And Polly's not speaking to me after the whole pen throwing in.
We've had quite a few questions actually about walking the battlefields and why that's important. And Gary, I know that you've got a lot of perspective on this as well. We all love walking the battlefields. Why don't you just tell us, for anyone who hasn't had the rare privilege of walking a battlefield, tell us why it's important to get out there and walk the ground.
That's true of any battlefield. I think to understand a battlefield, you do need to walk the ground. But I think in Gallipoli in particular, and we mentioned it in a podcast that we did with you, Matt, you can stand on the beach at Ari Banu and you look up and you see the Sphinx and you see Walker's Ridge and you see all these things that people talk about. We talked about oral history earlier. When I was talking earlier about Joe Murray talking about getting a Bain in the nick, you can stand in that precise spot. And unlike a lot of the Western Front battlefields, the Turkish battlefields are pretty much intact. So, for example, Pete mentions in the evacuation book, 4 of the French guns are left there. They're still there. You know, you can go, and they're rusty old hulks now, but they're there. You know, they're in situ. We went down to the French sector, and there's a shared well, which the French shared with the Turkish, still there. I do love that, yeah. You know, and again, we've mentioned it, you go to Gully Ravine, just before you walk up the gully, there's Joe Murray's well, which is described in his book, and you can see it, you can touch it, and you can raise water from it, I think, still, Pete, can't you? I wouldn't drink it, but you can still raise water from it. And you don't need much of an imagination. I don't have a great imagination. So being there, seeing it, it really does bring it home to you. And we've walked it, you know, in modern equipment, with plenty of water. And you mentioned the boot. There's a video of me after I've walked the boot on Facebook, and I am covered in sweat from head to toe. And I had, I think, 8 bottles of water with me that day. And these guys were doing this with limited water in very heavy uniforms, having just, you know, on the landings, been in the sea with salt water in that uniform. And you can get all of that in your head by walking the beaches. And, you know, Anzac Cove, for example, yeah, you can go, you can visit the cemeteries, you can do all of that. Aribanu Beach Cemetery is one of the most beautiful on the planet. You can do all of that, but actually go for a walk, you know, walk up to Quinns. You can see how close it was. Walk up to Lone Pine. You can work out where the Australians were and where the Turkish were, and it is remarkably close. You can do all of that.
And just a thing that, just briefly, Silt Spur, the Turks have recently cleared it. And I don't care how many times you've been to Gallipoli, I've never been so excited in my life as to see that. And the first time, myself and Matt, who are we're not as expert as people think we are in some ways. You don't carry it all in your head. But you remember, we didn't really know what we were looking at the first day, Matt. And then a bit of research on the internet. We got a map down from the 10th, was it the 10th Battalion? Yeah. And then next day, we followed every bloody line of that, looking. And I still remember standing in that periscope post, which is still there. And Gary, I took you there, and you could look out. You're just looking out over that narrow valley across to where the Turkish lines are, about what, 40, 50 yards away. It was amazingly emotive, and that's why I visit the battlefield, because it gives you a connection. And as a military historian, of course, the ground explains to you why certain things happened. For instance, why it failed. Besides, the main reason is the Turks, sorry, but fighting strength of the Turks. But you look at the battlefield, and you can also see why it failed.
And there's sorry, go ahead, Gary.
I was going to say, and then you can see how those lessons apply. You know, we've recently done podcasts on the Sicily landings and
Lambadoria
battery. Thank you. And you can see how the lessons they learned from Gallipoli were applied, just for example, in choosing the right beaches. Because you look at the beaches at Gallipoli and you think, bloody hell, that's not a beach. And then you see how they've learned from that. And how success ultimately came from what was a failure.
And at D-Day, of course, they make sure they get a big enough perimeter, a beachhead, by landing the airborne landings, the rest of it, making sure they get out to the Odon, making sure that they've got enough space behind which they can maneuver as a body, unlike at Gallipoli, where, especially at Anzac, they're just in the world's smallest beachhead. It's just not big enough to maneuver behind to provide any chance of success. It's heroic that they held it. I'm not getting on about that.
Thank you, gents. I'm going to ask a question that we got asked a lot. This was the most popular question, and a brief answer.
It's a really
the most controversial one. I'm just going to say Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill.
Winston Churchill is a great civilian politician, if you like that kind of thing. And an inspirational war leader in the Second World War. As First Lord of the Admiralty, in my view, he was a negative force. He made lots of mistakes about lots of things. It's not just Gallipoli. There's other things. The original escape of the Goeben and the Breslau, some people attribute to him. The taking of the Turkish battleships in the first place is down to him. It's not, though, entirely his fault. He was part of a cabinet, and actually, the First Lord of the Admiralty isn't that important a position, but everybody else in the cabinet went along with it. So I attribute the blame across the cabinet, but Churchill does bear a responsibility for conceiving of most of the idea and for doing something we're familiar with with politicians now, saying something will work when it clearly won't. I never really said that. Of course, we're going to have troops on the ground. That's not what you said in February. Well, it's what I'm saying now. And mission creep steps in. I'm not a big Churchill fan. I'll be honest with you. But I think denigration of him is foolish, very foolish indeed, because he was in many ways an incredible person. I'm choosing my words fairly careful. An incredible personality who had amazing drive, dynamism, full of ideas, full of something else as well.
Well, I think I would say he's a human being. You know, we often look back on people in history and we forget they're human beings, you know, and he didn't have all the answers, but at times he tried to provide answers. I agree, he was a great war leader, Second War. I've only recently found out there was a Second War, and he was a great war leader. But he made mistakes, and you know, the problem was he sometimes repeated them. You know, for example, the Royal Naval Division at Antwerp, you know, far too soon to commit them. But he repeated that. You know, he did that again. So I think you know, he's a flawed human being, as we all are.
Well said. We do have to wrap it up soon, but I want to get to some of these online questions that have been asked. So we'll belt through these pretty quickly. But question from Brian Briggs. Pete, is there a list of the books? Is there a list of books from the various people who've spoken tonight in one place?
I could put one up. Richard Van Emden and Steve Chambers wrote Gallipoli. Most books on Gallipoli, you just put the name of the author and the word Gallipoli.
Yeah.
Your own Walking Anzac, Walking Gallipoli book is an excellent guide to Gallipoli. The best, people always say, what's the best? The best books to read on Gallipoli, once you've read what I call a noddy book, which is a sort of one-volume book, is to read the official histories. Bain and the British official histories. They're actually all readable, and they are the bedrock on which you base your knowledge of Gallipoli.
And lots of the veterans that you've interviewed have books and things as well. Joe Murray, and there's a lot of good.
Joe Murray's is called,
Gallipoli as I saw it.
Thank you. Yeah. It's also called Gallipoli 1915 in a cheap paperback version.
So there's lots of those, which I'd recommend. Craig Roachy, one of our great historians who lives in Gallipoli, has a couple of questions. How many in the last lot to evacuate, I assume from Anzac? He's heard between 17 and 170. Pete, you may not have those figures to hand, but also Roachy also mentioned about the mine at the neck that was detonated as the Anzacs left.
Well, it's the last night. Well, there's 40,000 to go in the final stage, which is 2 nights. The last night is a total of 20, 10,000 at Suvla, 10,000 at Anzac. Yes, I'm reading this off my briefing paper. In all, since they were given the orders to retire, and around 7th, 8th of December, they got off 83,000 men, 186 guns, etc. It was an amazing achievement. So 10,000 at Suvla, 10,000 at Anzac is the last night figure. The last mine was not timed. The one, well, it's not as far as I know. The mine, Lieutenant Caddy left an account of blowing it. Arnall's mine and the other one. And the Arnall's mine, I think you were with me. I'm not sure whether you were, Matt, but you were, Gary, when the Turkish people whose name I've sadly forgotten, but Belaint was with them, and he would know. Belaint York was my usual guide. And they pointed out that the crater is clearly visible by the car park at the neck. That's the Arnall's crater. So as far as I know, it was blown up just as they left and wasn't timed. That's as far as I know, and certainly it's what's in my book.
I think it was a Lance Corporal having a fag.
That's at Hellas. Don't you confuse the issue.
It's a complicated discussion, and probably for another time. But the whole concept of booby traps, mines, the things that the Allies left behind, which does have a legitimate military purpose to slow down the enemy. If they're worried everything's going to blow up when they touch it, they're going to creep forward very, very slowly. But also there's the question as well: is it sporting to kill people after you've already packed up and left? So when you go to the neck, I should say to people, when you go to the neck, there's a Turkish memorial there, which there's some weird story about it's dedicated to a soldier who was killed on the first day. That's not true. That memorial was built to honour the 70 men killed in the mine explosion as the parting gift of the Anzacs as they left in December.
You can see the outline of the crater.
So back to these ones.
It's also worth noting that the Turkish authorities are clearing the neck area as well. So you can actually see a lot more now.
So Richard Bromhall says, thank you for the launch. He's got to leave. He hopes it'll be on Facebook. Yes, we're recording this, so we'll release a link so you can see it. Rob Thompson asked, to what extent does the book cover the logistics of the evacuation? In great detail. So, Rob, you'll be able to see that.
For Rob. Rob is a little bit of anal. So,
Ian McMillan, thanks for a great launch. Looking forward to reading the book. Thank you, Ian. Rochi again. Louise Coman, again, one of our great supporters. So talking about her family. So I agree, Louise, that oral history is very, very important. So thank you for your contribution. And also Anthony McAleer, thank you for your contribution as well. I agree, oral history is very important. Louise, again, Peter, what was the most pertinent or moving vignette that you can share from your interviews with veterans?
It's undoubtedly the one that was part of the thing. It's Murray's friend who he drags to the latrine, and then he topples into the latrine and drowns. He won't be listening, so I will tell you. I had a Geordie friend of mine who was in the band with me, those Naughty Lamps, and he was the bass player in the first version of the band. And he's quite a miserable Geordie. Oh, no disrespect to Geordies, but he's a miserable bastard. And I gave him that piece to read at the cemetery. Do you remember, Gary? You were there.
Yeah.
And he broke down and started crying halfway through because Murray comes from where he comes from, Burnopfield, just a mile or so from where Steve came from. And it did upset him. And you realise just how terrible these things are when you see he's not rough, but a sort of miserable Geordie just reduced to tears by a story that could have been his grandfather or great-grandfather. And I found that very moving. And I've always found that story moving. It's just too awful. And I urge people to listen to it. I think at some point we'll probably put an edited version up on one of the websites for people to listen to. But at the moment, you have to buy the pre-order the book to get it. Just to change the mood a bit, I can't help but notice I gaze at you and, not you, Jess, you are a sensible and intelligent woman, whereas these two are complete half-wits. And I noticed that there's this sort of helmet rivalry going to, as to who's got the biggest helmet. And, yeah, I mean, clearly you're winning, Matt, unless that's nearer.
I don't know the concept of near and far away. I mean, the West.
Yeah, so but certainly you seem to have the biggest helmet, Matt. So you've won.
Thank you for noticing. That was the reason I was here. I thank you everyone who's just said lovely comments about the book and how much they're looking forward to it. Some people have said they're going to come on our tour next year to Gallipoli, which will be awesome. We love having people. There's only 25 places on that tour and it's already half sold out. So if you do want to come with us, go to the website and book on that one. We'll end up here though. Someone's asked, Gary, that you seem to have a decent knowledge as well. Where does your love of history and your knowledge of history come from?
I suppose about 35 years ago, I just started to question, a really basic question, why would you slowly walk across from a trench across no man's land? I started reading, I think first book of all was Lynn MacDonald. And I just couldn't get the answer, because I just kept thinking, well, I wouldn't. I'm buggered if I'd do that. And I just kept reading because I couldn't get something that satisfied the question. And then as I approached 40, which was only last year or so, I thought, oh, I'd quite like to visit a battlefield. And I really wanted to go to Ypres. And I didn't get there when I was 40, but I got there when I was about 45. And I just did my own thing. I didn't go on a guided tour or whatever. I just went out there. And it just comes from that. And, you know, if you read enough about something, and for 30 years, I didn't read about anything else, something sinks in. And then, of course, I read one or two of Peter's books, and it just, yeah, it just completely turned me off, and I haven't read a book since.
And look at you now, living the dream by getting to hang out and share views with Peter.
Peter, Gersel Ankinguk.
Oh, two minds with a single brain cell. Gersel Ankinguk, I can't pronounce it. I apologise, sir. Was the chap who showed us the crater. Sorry, and it was rude of me to forget his name.
We should credit Jeff Harrison with that. He's messaged back.
Bugger him.
Well, I think that just about does it. It's been very enjoyable, gents. A good way to spend an hour and a half, especially on a rainy evening here in Sydney. I was struggling to hear what was going on half the time just because of the storm that's blowing over. But it's been so lovely. Thank you, everyone who tuned in. As we said, we did want to launch this book, and we were coming up with all sorts of creative ways to do it in the middle of lockdowns and COVID and everything else. So I hope you've enjoyed it. The book is outstanding. So we will have the e-version will be out very shortly. And then soon after that, we'll be sending out copies of the printed book. So it is absolutely outstanding, Pete. It's a great achievement. So thank you very much for agreeing to do it and for sharing your thoughts about it. Gary, thank you for being Peter's partner in crime. If everyone hasn't heard the Peter Hart Military History podcast, go and check it out. You get to hear these two and their unique interpretation of military history. It's a real pleasure. Check out my podcast, Living History, and all the stuff we're doing on YouTube as well. Lots of good videos coming out, including a video of Pete and I walking those trenches in Gallipoli that he was describing earlier on at Silt Spur. And of course, if you haven't ordered your copy of the book yet, please do. If you do it now, you've only got a week or so left to get that special interview with Peter that also includes all those wonderful quotes from Gallipoli veterans. I think there's 17 we put in there in the end, Pete. So just a wonderful addition to your library about Gallipoli. So please go to the website. Jess will put the details up in a moment so you can go and pre-order that book if you haven't done it already. But thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you for your contributions with everything that we do. And we'll see you out there very soon. Pete, Gary, Jess, thank you very much.
Yeah, well done, Jess. I'd like to thank you for all your help with this.
Thank you to Pete, Gary, Matt. It was a wonderful, informative and entertaining event. I certainly felt so, and I hope that everybody who joined us here tonight did too. And a special thank you to our special guests who joined us tonight. Dan Snow, thank you for taking the time to pre-record that incredible interview. And of course, Admiral Larken, it was an absolute honour. And Richard, thank you so much. Incredible historians, incredible veteran with amazing stories to share. We really appreciate that. Tonight, we just wanted to leave everybody with a little parting video, I suppose, about Gallipoli. So we'll turn it on. It looks at Gallipoli now and then as a way of just saying thank you and goodbye. And we too, I noticed a lot of comments there saying, can we do this again soon? We certainly hope so.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much, everybody.